I saw a post on Instagram recently that said, "Don't let others define who you are." The interesting thing is that actually that's the opposite of what Jesus said and lived by. Surprising? Well, let me tell you why I take my cue from Jesus on this one. First, let's unwrap a bit why we don't think it's smart to let other people define us. It usually comes out of a bad experience, right? We realize that other people aren't always consistent. If you've ever been through a breakup or had a relationship breakdown, you know that's true. We realize that other people aren't always kind. If you've ever been bullied or teased, you know that's true. And we realize that other people aren't always accepting. If you've ever been shunned or excluded or left out, you know that's true. And so we realize that it's probably not that safe to put our identity in the hands of other people, to let others define us, because we'll end up being tossed and turned around all over the place. Our identity isn't secure in the hands of other people. The problem is, we're people too. We're not always consistent. We're not always kind to ourselves or to others. We're not always accepting of who we are or of who others are. If you're anything like me, your identity doesn't always even feel secure in your own hands. That's what insecurity is. And that's why I love the way that Jesus defined himself. And it teaches me where to place my identity. You see, Jesus had every reason not to let others define him. Jesus knew the kind of people that Instagram post is probably talking about. He faced rejection, he faced criticism, he faced abuse, he faced people who didn't accept him for who he was. And yet Jesus chose to define himself in relation to others. Now, don't get me wrong, Jesus was completely clear about who he was. I don't know what you think about Jesus, and don't worry, you can reserve judgment on that for now. But I just want you to know the two titles that Jesus gave himself most often to help others understand who he was. Jesus did this weird thing of referring to himself in the third person, and that's where we get these two titles from. The first title that Jesus referred to himself with was Son of Man. We hear this in Mark's account of Jesus' life, in Mark's Gospel. He says, "The Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many." And with this title, Jesus was completely defining himself in relation to humanity. Everything he was for the sake of others, even up to death on a cross. He believed he was there for the sake of the world. The second title that Jesus used for himself was Son of God. In John's Gospel, we hear this title being used a lot. In fact, in the account of Jesus' baptism in John's Gospel, it says, as he came up out of the water, the heavens opened and a voice declared, "This is my Son, with whom I am well pleased. This is my Son." And Jesus always referred back to God when he talked about himself. He always pointed back to his Heavenly Father as his source of authority, as the one from whom he had come in order to save the world. In fact, in John's Gospel a little later on, he says, if I just testified about myself, if I just backed myself, if I just claimed I was who I said I was, then my testimony would be worth nothing. But the Father himself testifies about me. And this is no more true than in the case of Jesus' resurrection. When Jesus walked out of an empty tomb 3 days after he had been executed, that was proof definitive that God was testifying about Jesus, that God was backing up who Jesus said he was. Jesus defined himself completely according to his Father, and he relied on his Father to back him up for who he was. So Jesus was completely defined by who he was to and for others. And through it all, he was defined by love. And do you know Jesus did all of that for you? That Jesus was actually defined by his love for you. And he paid the highest price on your behalf. You are so incredibly loved because of all that Jesus did for you. And then he invited those who wanted to follow him to allow themselves to be defined, not by what they said about themselves, not by what the world said about them, but by what God says about them, and to be defined by their love for others. In 1 John 3 verse 1, it says, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us." What kind of love? Well, you know, earlier we said there are all these reasons why we can't let others define us, because they're not consistent, they're not always kind, they're not always accepting. This kind of love, God's kind of love, is always kind. It is so consistent. In fact, it's never ending. And it's better than just accepting, it's unconditional and it's transformational. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we would be called children of God. That's what God says about you. That's what Jesus wanted people to know God said about them. That's what Jesus wanted people to define themselves by. That we would be called children of God, for that is what we are. You know, your identity is secure in the hands of God. Might not be secure in the hands of yourself or the hands of others, it's secure in the hands of God. What God says about you is better than what you think about yourself. Hear me, what God says about you is better than what you think about yourself, and what God says about others is definitely better than what you think of them. You are loved. You're invited to live in love. You're invited to be defined by the love that God has for you and the love that you have for others. Just as Jesus was and is. That is a secure identity to pin your life on.